So welcome to today's webinar on moral injury through the lens of equity and diversity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions and the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. My name is Kathy, and I'm the project coordinator of this center. We'll be co-facilitating and introducing this webinar today with my colleague PJ Wenger. The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. Next slide, please. And if you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen. Slide, please. Following the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. Next slide, please. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint slides in the next couple of days. Next slide. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect the questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer these questions. Slide, please. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of SAMHSA or DHHS for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. I will turn this over to PJ, who will introduce our presenter for today. Thank you all. PJ, you're muted.
Sorry. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Brock. Dr. Brock is Senior Vice President of Moral Injury Programs at Volunteers of America. She was raised in a military family and was the first Asian American woman to earn a doctorate in theology. Dr. Brock was director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University from 1997 to 2001, a fellow at the Harvard Divinity School Center for Values in Public Life from 2001 to 2002, and a visiting scholar at the Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley from 2002 to 2012. In 2012, she co-founded the Soul Repair Center, Bright Divinity School at TCU with Colonel Chaplain Herman Kaiser Jr., U.S. Army veteran, and directed it until May 2017. Her most recent book is Soul Repair, Recovering from Moral Injury After War, co-authored with Gabriela Latina, the first book written on moral injury. So with that, Dr. Brock, I turn it over to you.
Dr. Brock, you're muted.
Dr. Brock, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry, the mute control moved. Sorry. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm delighted to share what I know about moral injury with you. It's, I think, a relatively new term in mental health work still, although there's more and more being published on it. And the main area that got the most research, and is still the sort of elephant in the room around moral injury, is the work with military veterans. But since the pandemic, I think there's been an enormous amount of sudden research on it, including even a moral injury event scale for healthcare workers because of the kind of pressures the pandemic has put on everyone. And so I'm partly speaking in that context of the emergency situations that so many more people have been facing, and how valuable I think the research on military veterans, which is the research I'm most familiar with, can offer all of us. So in order, I think, to understand how complicated moral injury is as a phenomenon, I think it's important to understand that what we would call a moral identity is quite complicated. It's not simply ethics, which is often what morality is confined to, is deciding on the principles of right and wrong and making decisions based on those principles, but rather a moral identity involves what I would call 5 dimensions of existence, and they're all important. The first one is habit. So somehow now, okay, habits are things that start to happen to us from the moment we're born. We start to mimic other people's behavior. Our capacity for feeling other people's feelings is part of the development of habits, where we learn what gets negative responses, what gets positive responses, how people actually react to us emotionally. All of that happens before we even really have language. And it becomes a kind of body memory that we develop habits of behavior just as our bodies automatically do things. And those patterns are learned from repetition training and emotional reinforcement. And a lot of what we do in daily life is moral habit. So if you, for example, are standing in a line and somebody steps on your foot, if you had tripped and hurt your foot, it would be sort of morally neutral. You might feel sort of stupid for hurting your foot, but it wouldn't affect you in a moral kind of way usually. But if you're standing in a line and someone steps out and actually steps on your foot and causes you pain, and that person just looks at your foot and turns around and turns away, you would probably make an implicit moral judgment that something is wrong here. Because the normal habit of behavior that most of us learn is when we do that, we say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, are you okay?" Or we find some way to restore a harmonious relationship because we somehow disrupted it, even with a stranger. So often that kind of behavior is just slotted as etiquette or just decent behavior. But it's habit. It's not something we have to think consciously about in our daily interactions with people. We are just thoughtful and kind in ordinary ways, but habit has moral content when it's violated. So I think that's really important to know, because 90% of the time we're just on autopilot for being moral persons. The second element of being a moral person is a meaning system. And there are a lot of varieties of meaning systems, and somehow we manage in a society as complicated as ours to have various moral meaning systems and still somehow be able to communicate and interact with each other. And that's partly because meaning is how we orient to reality. It's how we treat other people. And it's learned through the language we acquire and our ability to use what we're taught as a filter system to take in that reality. So we get about 1 billion pieces of information a day through our perceptual system in our brain, and most of it we pay no attention to. It's not important. A meaning construct is what tells us what's important. What is fear-inducing? What is love-inducing? These are all things we have to learn. They're not just automatically given to us. And that's what a meaning system is. It's a way we relate to the larger world around us. And that larger world in most meaning systems includes the entire cosmos. What do we think of the stars and the moon cycles, as well as how we treat our pets and our children and each other. Rituals are one way, habits of meaning, that the courtesies I talked about that enact those meanings constructs. We don't think that we're enacting them, but they are meaning constructs that guide how we understand the body, nature, other people's behavior, and our own behaviors. And often for people, that involves a community that constantly reinforces the meaning system through ritual practices called worship or religion. For other people, it's a philosophical approach. They may not be religious at all, but everybody has some sort of meaning construct, or we couldn't function in reality. And then there's a third category that's related to meaning constructs, but are the hard walls around a meaning construct that's a moral meaning system that you cannot cross. If you cross those hard walls, you put yourself outside of a respectable society. You put yourself in a criminal class or some other place that's not where moral people are. And those are usually laws in our modern societies. We call them laws. In the US, of course, we have the Constitution, sort of the bedrock set of things that are, when people swear service to their country, they swear an oath to the Constitution. That's the wall that you may not cross. In Judeo-Christian traditions, it's often the Ten Commandments or something like a golden rule. And in Buddhism, there's a whole list of things that you're supposed to adhere to in order to be doing the right practices of Buddhism. And they're usually claims that are universal. Those rules are not understood to be culture specific. For example, murder is something that is, most people would say in almost every society, there's some kind of restriction on killing another human being that puts you outside of normal society. So the way murder is defined, it may differ culturally, but there are these hard rules that are really important for people understanding that they're good people. And then there are rituals, and rituals that are habit forming also deliver the meaning system that the ritual is enacting. And the ritual takes place outside normal, ordinary experience and time. It's not the same kind of sense of time as you go to work at a certain time, you do your job and you go home. Ritual creates its own space in time that's outside of ordinary time, where things get enacted, like the story of how a faith was formed, or a season of something that happened in the history of that faith that is enacted. So right now, Muslims are in the ritual space of Ramadan, which is a month long and involves spiritual discipline and fasting that reminds people about being generous and about having gratitude for the things that they have, and all kinds of things that happen in that space of Ramadan, which is very not normal because most of these people eat during the day. And so for an entire month, not eating during the day puts you in a liminal space, a special time and place. And in that special time and place, often the ideals or values of a tradition are enacted in a kind of form that makes you aspire to them. So you may not be perfectly generous, you may not be perfectly grateful, but in a worship space, you enact those values as if you really held to them. And that kind of training and ritual can actually move you deeper into those spaces of being a better person. And then ritual also not only gives you a reality to aspire to in terms of the highest ideals you might have, but it also is a space often where things that are chaotic or difficult to handle are handled in a way that helps you integrate them rather than be afraid or try to deny them. And usually those areas of ambiguity, change, difference are things that are huge events like death, birth, sex is also very powerful force, illness, greeting a stranger, understanding gender. These are major things in human existence that have a lot to do with who we are. And ritual is one place where those powerful forces are handled so they don't cause destruction. And so you can see here, these are 3 examples of ritual. The first one is a bat mitzvah. It's a bar mitzvah. It's a boy. It's a female. It's a bat mitzvah within Judaism, which marks 2 things. It can mark the transition to being an adult religious person, a kind of person who has all the skills that enact the faith. So they read from the text in Hebrew, and they demonstrate their adult relationship to their tradition. And the other way that a bat mitzvah can work is that it's a way to convert to Judaism as an adult later on. I have a friend who was 65 who grew up secular and Jewish, and she actually had her bat mitzvah when she was 65, when she became a formal member of a Jewish community. So it has 2 purposes, but it's a transition. It's a sort of place where a transition is sort of awkward, and they have a formalized way to make it formal to say, yes, you really now belong to us in a full way. And the middle one is a similar adolescent ceremony, but it's done for girls. This is a Southwestern tradition. I think the Apaches do it, and there's several other tribes that do this kind of adolescent ritual for girls. They do it also for boys, but it's different. For the girls, they have to prove they're strong by running a lot. It takes days, and they also have to end the ceremony, and this is the end, where they cook ritual food, a corn cake that's a symbol of what a woman does in her life. And they enact it so that at the end of the ceremony, they have transitioned from being a girl to being a woman. And then the final one is a baptism, a Christian baptism, in which an adult person who has chosen to convert or to confess their faith in Christianity is then taken through a baptismal ritual that then means that they are now a full-fledged member of the community. And all of these processes have to do with how they are now assenting to the values of their new role through a ritual process. These are really important transition marks in human societies. We do it with graduations, we do it with marriages, we do it with baby baptisms. There are all kinds of ways we mark human transitions and powerful forces with rituals that help us understand what it means to be a person that's a good person in that tradition. And the last thing, and this is why moral injury is so important to understand, is that experiences of reality often deeply challenge our meaning systems and our moral systems. So when reality is reassuring, it can lead to creative and wondrous and curiosity inducing and resilient maintaining experiences, but it can also become so chaotic that it becomes traumatic or completely fractures the meaning system that you thought you knew oriented you to the world. And those shattering experiences, if they are not integrated back into a new system that can take them in, people's identity is destabilized. Because moral injury is at the core of a person's identity. And these are just 2 definitions that were the earliest definitions for moral injury for veterans. And the first one by Jonathan Shea describes it as a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation, all 3. So all 3 parts have to be in place for moral injury to occur. So he regards moral injury fundamentally as a major betrayal of trust and the emotional response to that betrayal. Later on, a group from the VA in 2009 published an essay, and then in 2016 wrote a book about moral injury. And they describe moral injury as a syndrome of shame, self-handicapping, anger, and demoralization that occurs when deeply held beliefs and expectations about moral and ethical conduct are transgressed. It is distinct from a life threat, as it is also not inherently fear-based. It can arise from killing, perpetration of violence, betrayals of trust in leaders, witnessing depraved behavior, or failing to prevent serious unethical acts. So moral injury is a profound form of suffering, but it's being debated right now still in mental health communities about whether it's really belongs in the DSM as a disorder or whether it's really a kind of suffering that requires a healthy conscience to be working, so that it's not a disorder, but it's the normal human response to abnormal, devastating experiences. So, there are questions about could we expand for the DSM the description of post-traumatic stress disorder to complex post-traumatic stress disorder that could include some of the aspects of moral injury under that umbrella. And of course, the whole discussion about needing a diagnosis has to do with mental health and being able to be professional and charge for it and all those sorts of questions. But it's an interesting debate. It's a really and some of us who study religion understand that it's not a new phenomenon. It's got a new name, but almost every religion has some process for figuring out what to do with people who violate their norms and feel terrible about it. But one of the ways that you can identify moral injury is that it's a change in a person's character, that they don't see themselves, or something's off, or they completely pulled away from you, or there's some major change in their character because they're having an identity crisis. And it results from harmful experiences or life conditions that a person or group is unable to justify, process, and integrate into a reliable identity and meaning system that sustains their relationships and supports their flourishing. So it's not a minor thing to experience moral injury, and it's important to pay attention to it. This is just a list of some of those conditions and life factors that put people at risk, and multiple factors can make people even more susceptible to experiencing moral injury when things go terribly wrong. So when you have work in life or death consequences, you're expected to do your job almost perfectly. You have people who are physically dependent or emotionally charged. If you face in the work you do constant ethical dilemmas with limited choices and high risk for reliability, for liability, you have a lot of responsibility with not a lot of control. You might be betrayed by people in power, parents, supervisors, policymakers, authorities of the state, that they don't do the right thing and they cause you to fail. You may be working in isolated conditions or living in isolated situations, and you may be carrying unresolved other traumas into the process that you're in and the experience that you had. And you have a religious or spiritual meaning system that is highly punitive. In other words, it has very clear rules about good and evil, and it's easy to tell that you've crossed that line, and crossing that line results in serious punishment, that can make moral injury actually worse. So I think as if you start to clock through some of these, you can understand why the pandemic and the current situation we're in has created some of these conditions for people who normally wouldn't be living with them, or exaggerated them for people who ordinarily already face risk for moral injury. And especially, I think you can see why healthcare has been so devastatingly impacted by people experiencing moral distress, and then that escalating to moral injury because they aren't able to do their jobs as they were trained to do. And sometimes even when you're trained to a job that has life or death consequences, you're often trained to it by habit. You're trained to do things automatically without having to think about it. So you get somebody that can't breathe, you know you have to put them on a ventilator, you don't think about it, you order it. But in a situation where you have too many people and not enough ventilators, you actually can't move on automatic pilot. You actually have to stop and ask yourself, who can I save? Who's the likeliest to make it through? And you have to let people die. And that is not a habit you're trained to. So it can be really devastating in a situation where your life conditions or your work environment has has chaos thrown into it. And I think you can also think about what's going on in the profession of public school teaching these days with so many school shootings, and now teachers having to do active shooter drills. And this is not something they were trained to in school for the job of a teacher. And so we can think of a lot of professions that have shifted into higher risk for moral injury in the last decade or so, and now in the pandemic. So this is just one of the scales. There are 3 now that try to discover whether someone might have been exposed to something and have moral injury. This is one designed for healthcare professionals, and there's one now for people who work in child protective services, and for parents and aged out foster youth in child protective services. And the original one was designed for military veterans. And so, so there are now at least 3 of these scales. And they're helpful if you want to determine if somebody you're working with might have moral injury as an underlying suffering in a mental health crisis. So this is a diagram that Bill Nash, who's a psychiatrist for the VA in Greater Los Angeles, and is one of the few psychiatrists who was also a combat veteran. He was a Marine Corps psychiatrist and was at the Second Battle of Fallujah. He has created this Venn diagram to explain why moral injury and PTSD aren't the same thing, but they share certain things in common. And so you can be thinking that you have someone with PTSD and you're treating them for PTSD, but you may not see that what they have is moral injury. And there was a study done in the Minneapolis VA with veterans where they had one group going through PTSD treatment with that diagnosis, another group with that diagnosis, but also going through a chaplain-led moral injury program. And they demonstrated that if you address moral injury, it actually improves the treatment outcomes for PTSD, which is why I think mental health professionals need to understand moral injury, that you may have somebody who's not doing very well, and the underlying cause may not be that they have a more serious case of PTSD. It may be that they're experiencing moral injury but don't know how to talk about it. So moral injury is not PTSD because it's not necessarily fear-based. A person with moral injury may feel anxiety and dread, but the main emotions that determine moral injury have to do with what are called the moral emotions, like sorrow, remorse, regret, guilt, shame, embarrassment, a sense of alienation, isolation from decent human beings, humiliation, dread and anxiety, despair. Those are some of the what I would call inner feelings. And then there are things that become expressed, I think, as having moral injury, which include outrage and fury, sort of anger that can't be controlled, disgust, mistrust, contempt, bitterness, frustration, and cynicism. These are all often signs that someone has underlying moral injury. And this is another Bill Nash diagram, which he explains that all these dimensions are part of moral injury. So the emotional repertoire somebody's carrying that have all those moral emotions built into it, the way their relationships have been broken or damaged, the way their self-concept works, which is that I'm not good, I can't be trusted, I don't deserve to live. Then there's the concept of the world with the broken meaning system. Then there's the ability to be in touch with your inner self in a way that you can actually have some authority over your self-understanding and behavior. That's compromised by moral injury. And moral injury can be quite unstable. Somebody can seem fine because they're doing things to cope with it. And then it may erupt because of some trigger or some life incident that just makes all of it come back. And so it can be unstable over time. And I've actually talked to people who thought they were fine for decades and then got slammed because of a serious illness or a life event that sort of all that way that they have been keeping it down broke down, and they had a serious meltdown. So here are some of the assumptions behind what I'm saying about moral injury. One is that it's a human condition to be born moral, and I'm saying that as a theologian, but it's also what Bill Nash, a psychiatrist, and Brett Litz, a psychologist at the Boston VA, who all of them research moral injury, and their work on moral injury is what brought to them to this conclusion that it's a profound form of human suffering, because we're born moral. We're born to need to be moral to maintain our relationships to reality and the people we love. And when reality is chaotic and unsafe, we have to figure out how to manage it with collective moral meaning systems that sometimes become multiple. And most of us have more than one moral meaning system, because what we do with our families and what counts as moral behavior may be quite different from what happens at work or on the subway or places like that. So, but when reality gets too chaotic and unsafe, even our multiple meaning systems can break down, because our identity breaks down. So moral injury is a devastating and ordinary, I would claim, human experience of moral failure, and not a disorder. And yet it's a profound form of suffering. It's related to trauma and can be experienced alongside it with PTSD, but it isn't the same as either of those things. You can actually have moral injury without having had an actual trauma. I know an Air Force pilot who worked during the Cuban Missile Crisis, whose target was Moscow, who his moral injury 40 years later was, how could he have even imagined starting a nuclear war at the age of 23 as a married father of 2? What kind of person does that? And he was having a major moral crisis from just imagining doing something which he was never asked to do. So it isn't, he didn't have trauma. He didn't have that kind of trauma from having experienced terror. He just had a moral meltdown because he was willing to do something he now cannot imagine a decent human being being willing to do. So I think every society, religion, and culture tries to address it, but not all approaches actually help alleviate it. Sometimes those approaches can make it worse. So I think it's important to help people as they experience moral injury, think about the values that they had, and how those impact the way they feel, and how they're going to negotiate their way through those values. And so because moral injury is such a huge experience of identity and values and experience, recovery is not a simple thing. It's probably a lifelong process if the experience was extremely shattering, like having to do a lot of killing in a war. But it is possible for people to recover and integrate those experiences. That it's not that the experiences are forgotten or that the feelings of shame and guilt just completely disappear. But once a person begins to externalize those stories and experiences and process them and think about them and reflect on them, they begin to be able to put them in perspective in the picture of the life that they have as an incident or an event or an experience that now informs their life, and can give them a kind of wisdom about their life without the feelings driving their behavior. And that's really the difference, I think, between being trapped in moral injury, where it's driving behavior, alienation, self-hate, self-condemnation, and it's become a source of information that you had an experience like that once, and it led to those feelings. And how are you going to have a meaning system that can integrate what happened and still help you feel like you're worthy of love? And that process, I have a student who was in Iraq as an ordnance disposal specialist, who had a pretty serious case of moral injury. And he writes on, he's now done a doctorate on it. And he's constantly writing and processing his experience. And that to me is a sign of his resilience, that he's not afraid to face into it. He's still trying to understand it, and he will probably be spending the rest of his life writing about it. But he's a stable, and he's actually a minister of a church now. And he's able to have a life that's meaningful to him, that gives him joy and makes him feel valuable again in service to other people from that processing that he did in seminary and in graduate school. But that was 8-9 years of processing. And that was after college, where he also started the processing. And and my friend, the Air Force pilot, was, in his 70s when he started processing something from 40 years ago. He was very high functioning. He managed to live for 40 years without having to deal with it, what he was feeling. As he said, I spent 40 years playing a lot of golf and making a lot of money and not thinking about it. But when it hit him, he had to think about it. He could not move forward with his life without thinking about it and processing it. So I'm going to pause there, because I know I've dumped a lot of information on you, and I want to pause to see where you have questions about anything I've said, and where you have comments from your own experience, perhaps. But I'd like the rest of our time to be more of a conversation.
So Dr. Brock, there is a question in the Q&A. Someone is asking, is there a scale for moral injury related to sexual trauma? If not, why?
I do not know if there is one, but I will say I do not know of one, but there may be people working on it. Kristen Leslie, who is a colleague of mine at Eden Theological Seminary, is a national expert on military sexual trauma. I'm not sure she would, I actually don't know what she thinks of the current moral injury event scale, but she might be working on something like that, or someone else might be working on something like that. Generally, what happens is people create a scale, and then they test it on populations that they think might have experienced it, to determine whether it's useful in identifying moral injury in that population. And the two scales I meant, the three scales I mentioned, the one for military veterans, the one for healthcare workers, and the one in child protective services, have different research methodologies. So the veteran one and the healthcare one is your more standard survey-oriented, statistical evidence-based kind of survey that tests those surveys. The one in child protective services that Wendy Haight, the professor of social work at the University of Minnesota, developed is she took those criteria from the military one and adapted it to kind of experiences that people in child protective services are exposed to, and used that survey to create a set of questions for qualitative interviews. So her methodology was not quantitative, but qualitative. And so that's how she demonstrated that moral injury existed in child protective services, was by interviewing parents and social workers and aged out foster youth to identify what their experiences were and whether they would identify them as morally injurious. So I think that could be easily transferred and done with survivors of sexual abuse and other kinds of trauma. I would say that Jonathan Shea, the first definition I mentioned, who's sort of the originator of the term moral injury, worked with Judith Herman there's a sort of cluster of trauma experts like Jonathan Shea, Judith Herman, and Bessel van der Kolk that all knew each other and worked together in the Boston area. And Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, which addresses sexual abuse and rape, describes the experiences of sexual abuse survivors and rape survivors as complex PTSD. And Jonathan Shea actually thinks that what she is describing as complex PTSD is actually moral injury. So, so there are sort of ways in which this thinking is evolving around the other kinds of experiences of trauma. So it's a really great question. It's a long answer. Basically, I don't know of one, but I think it's highly likely that it's in that population. I know I had a student in a class I taught at Union, an intensive class I taught at Union Seminary several years ago, that was looking at populations of women who might have had necessary abortions that they didn't want to have. And whether there was moral injury there as well, or even in those who chose to have abortions but were conflicted morally about it. So as I said, I think that the religions have sort of recognized this as a problem in their communities for a very long time, that mental health is now beginning to look at conscience and moral injury. Not it used to be that if you had guilt and shame, they just wanted to talk you out of it because they were regarded as neuroses. And I think what veterans are insisting, and I think they're right about this, is if you throw people into horrifying conditions and they come out feeling horrible about them, it is not a neurosis, it's a normal human response of moral conscience to devastating experiences. So do we have any more comments or questions?
Yes, we do. We have another question in Q&A.
Good.
So any
Yeah.
suggestions on manuals, workbooks, and or treatments for MI specifically targeting guilt and shame?
That's a great question. I don't think particular moral emotions are lifted out of a whole cluster of them and treated separately. Because it's also Joseph Currier, who's a psychologist at University of Alabama, who studies moral injury and religion and other things really carefully. He says your brain doesn't distinguish, if you look at MRIs and things, your brain doesn't distinguish guilt and shame. They look the same if you look at a person's neurological system. And so the way we articulate things in language may not capture the full extent of them. And it may be that a person who's feeling guilt and shame may also be feeling humiliation, anger, and a whole bunch of other clusters. And so I don't think people are trying to separate them out. But I know that certain people who look at them do that. It's the same way that that forgiveness has been lifted out as one resolution for moral injury. But what's interesting is the veterans that I've worked with who are processing their moral injury rarely use the word forgiveness. They may learn to use it if they're working with a chaplain or someone for whom forgiveness is a concept. But my friend who I wrote about in our book Soul Repair, Camilo Mejia, who grew up Catholic in Nicaragua in that liberation movement there, so he's a sort of liberation theology Catholic. I asked him one time about whether he thought about killing someone as a thing that he could be forgiven for, and his response was, I didn't know the person's name. I don't know who they are or anyone in their family. So the people I harmed can't forgive me because I don't know who they are. And I don't know why someone else would feel they had the authority to forgive me if they weren't wronged by what I did. And he said, he said, I think what I have come to feel is that I accept that I was capable of killing someone, and that if I ever felt good about that, I would stop being a moral person. So I've learned to accept that as information about my life that gives me motivation to want to live a life that serves others and maybe makes up for some of the harm I caused. So he just sort of avoided the word forgiveness. So I think it's what I found is that if you just let people bring their own language to their own process, that's what helps them begin to sort it all out. And I will say that the film Almost Sunrise, which is a documentary about two veterans who have moral injury, that one of the veterans, they walked across from the country from Wisconsin to Los Angeles to process their war experience. And the one of them was pretty much helped by it and went home, but the other one was still unresolved. And he wound up going to a yoga workshop. And then he wound up talking to a Catholic priest about forgiveness. And what he realized, it's not in the film, but he told me later, what he realized in that yoga workshop was the reason he still wasn't okay is he was deeply angry at God, even though he was not a religious person. He was deeply angry at God for letting his best friend die right next to him in battle. And he just was just furious at God. And he realized in the yoga workshop that he needed to forgive God. So that was a whole twist on forgiveness I hadn't ever even thought about. But he talked to a Catholic priest, and the priest led him through a ritual of forgiveness. And then he felt fine, or not fine, but he felt resolved about the thing that was keeping him from going home and feeling okay. So that's a long, it's again, so the, we keep searching for words that somehow will help fix the problem. And I think the person has to find that word rather than having it imposed.
Another question is, how does this apply to grief we experience when losing loved ones and family members dying of COVID in isolation?
That's a huge one because, of course, one of the most important rituals in any religious tradition is how to deal with death. And it's actually the case that most human beings can't really descend into deep grief without a ritual to hold them so they feel safe doing it, because they know they'll be able to come back to reality from this deep immersion into grief. And that it's not something then that you're over, but you're able to handle. And I think the fact that so many of us have been denied an adequate way to grieve means that there's a lot of delayed grief, and that grief is probably complicated by a lot of factors that are revolving around why those rituals aren't possible. And there was a community in Alabama that I think experienced a whole different way of a wave of moral injury, because they decided to have a funeral it was early in the pandemic. They decided to have a funeral for the person who died. And then a huge number of the people who were at the funeral got COVID. And so they had more death, which is the flip side of not being able to grieve right now, is that you could wind up feeling even worse if you try to do it. And so I think there's going to be a need once people can get back together for a lot of lamentation rituals. And some of them need to be large and at a national scale, because I think we've not only lost individuals in our own families, but I think we've also been exposed to failures and things in our society that we haven't had to look at before. Especially if we have economic and race privilege that are suddenly making us realize that the good society we thought we had might not actually be all that good. So that's why I think the pandemic has been devastating, and that we will see a kind of epidemic of moral injury that's already emerging in healthcare, of course, but also in the larger society. And I personally feel some of that delayed grief myself, because a very beloved member of my family died on February 27th in California. I live in Virginia, and they're waiting to hold a memorial till the family can gather for her, because she was such a key member of our family. And I just, every now and then I see a sad show or something, I hear a story about somebody else with a similar loss, and all of that grief comes back. So yeah, the grief is in many ways, I think, an underlying emotion in moral injury, because you've not only lost your own sense of being a good person or your own innocence, but you may also have lost your trust in others or in institutions that you once believed in. And that's a huge loss. It's a loss of meaning and identity that is enormous. And so some people will go into despair, others will go into toxic anger. There are a lot of responses to that kind of moral injury.
Dr. Brock, can you speak to how moral injury may be displayed across various cultures?
Good question. Every tradition has different ways they handle grief and moral injury. So in some cultures, people won't even talk about it unless they have a ritual to process it. In other cultures, talking about it with family and friends is a way to process it. And some cultures have, I think, better rituals for processing what we would call moral injury. So I think it varies a lot. And I also think in the United States, especially, and this is true in other places, but the country I know best is the United States, that there are different populations with different histories of trauma in relation to the dominant culture. And trauma can be transmitted from generation to generation. So if you are African American and you know anything about your family history or the lives of African Americans in the United States for 400 years, you are probably carrying some of the legacies of that history in your own flesh and family. And if it hasn't been adequately processed, it can be an actual experience of trauma in your body that you carry forward. And that affects your capacity to be resilient. It affects your capacity to process new insults, new traumas that can affect you again. So I think, and in my own East Asian culture, talking about your feelings or traumas is sort of not really done. People intuit from your behavior, your silences, your weeping, or some sign that you may be in emotional distress, and they will do kind things. But the explicit, I have a problem, I need to talk about it, approach to suffering and trauma is not really how my mother, for example, who's Japanese, that's not how we handle those sorts of things. And I'm not saying that what we did was better or worse than another culture. I think it's just important to understand that cultures differ. There are some cultures in which the whole collective body will process through ritual one person's trauma. They will just do it. They will do it with exorcism or spirit visits or other things. And in my own case, when my Japanese mother died of a very disfiguring cancer at 55, I actually had been in a women's group that use letter writing of unfinished business with people as a way to process some of our own traumas. And so I sat down the week she died because I was depressed, and I'm rarely depressed. I wrote her a very long letter that started with everything I was angry with her for, and then all the things that I would miss about her and was grateful for. And after sobbing for about 2 hours writing this letter, she came and visited me in her physically whole body. And that's when I began to understand the East Asian sense of the value of ancestors who come and visit. I have no explanation for the ontological reality of what I experienced. I was not dreaming, I was awake. And I deeply experienced her being present to me, which made me also appreciate how common the experience of visitations of the dead are for people. Doesn't happen for everyone, but in a lot of cultures, that is how people are comforted. And in a Buddhist funeral ritual, it's often not the case that people talk about the dead person, but they talk to the spirit of the dead person to do all their unfinished business so that spirit can be released to go on to the next phase of its life. And I think there's some wisdom in that. So yes, the cultures vary considerably. And the history of how those cultures have been treated where they exist in the United States has something to do with how much they have to process every time something happens to that community.
Okay, another question. Would you say that people who have embraced extremism use intense self-justification to prevent negative feelings of moral injury?
Yes, and I've actually just written a piece that'll be published in the Christian Century about that exact problem. I think I'm a Christian theologian, so I'm saying this from some knowledge. I spent my I was raised in a Buddhist family till I was 6. I was moved to the United States to a military family, and I spent every summer in August going to Southern Baptist revivals until I was 13. So for 7 years, I was involved with evangelical Baptist traditions in the South. And that kind of Christianity never made any sense to me, partly because the emotional individualism of going forward and the weeping and all that was like so not Japanese. The sort of reserve of a Japanese person was not to make a spectacle of yourself emotionally. So I couldn't relate to that, but I also couldn't relate to the idea that I was so bad that what God did to Jesus is what I deserved. So I just never could. The Christianity just didn't make a lot of sense to me. And what I've realized since then is that the kind of theological tradition that tells people that they're originally so bad and helpless that there's nothing they can do themselves, and that someone else had to take the blame and take the punishment so that they could be loved by God, actually starts with the premise of moral injury, that they are bad, that their worth and their identity is broken, and that it has to be made whole by someone else, because the magnitude of how broken you are is something you couldn't fix yourself. And so that theology, it's called the atonement, the atoning death of Jesus, that Jesus died for your sins, is very common in Western Christianity. It's not just evangelicals that believe it, plenty of other kinds of Christians believe it. But I think the more narrowly you're captured by that idea, because you're traumatized, or you are traumatized by the idea, you come with trauma or that's unresolved, or you are traumatized by that process, the more you're afraid to challenge it, the more it's built on a system of fear rather than giving people confidence in love. And so I think that it's therefore not an accident that it's a very conservative, far right evangelical Christianity that sort of fuels the kind of extremism we're seeing right now politically. It isn't that there aren't Christians there are Christians that believe that Jesus died for their sins that don't get caught up in the far right conspiracy theory process, but I think it's because they actually do believe they're loved and they don't need to hate anybody else because they're supposed to love everyone, and they're just not trapped in fear. Because I had a Baptist minister in high school who was a fundamentalist who was one of the most loving people I know, and I actually asked him to baptize me because I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be that loving. So it's not that the idea itself is the problem, but I think when it connects with a social system or trauma or inherited or trauma experiences that reinforce that fearfulness of needing something to save you, and that you can't let it go because any doubt or any information that's rational or scientific that might challenge it is going to challenge your very identity and being and safety, means you have to really lock into it, and you can be that way about the political ideas that also go with it.
Okay, we have another question here. Any suggestions for dealing with raising grandchildren who are dealing with trauma in their lives? I am doing this with 3 grandsons, one who is now a Marine, but also my other 2 are still in school. My daughter and 1 grandson are the same age and are sophomores. So any suggestions for dealing with raising grandchildren who are dealing with trauma in their lives?
Yeah, I think it's really important to try to be a non-anxious, loving presence. And in moments where you have a possibility of a chance to talk to them without other people hearing, or a safe place to have a conversation with them, and they seem open to it. You always have to, it's like with kids, I know this, you just have to wait for the opportunities. You can't like make opportunities and then expect them to perform. You have to sort of wait. But you can ask them neutral questions like, how are things with you? How has it, just how has it been? Or if you notice something that they seem to be preoccupied with, what's interesting about that for you? Or what's scary about that for you? That you just ask sort of, not what's wrong with you, not judgment, not questions of evaluation, but questions of curiosity and wonder about how they are. Sometimes they will start talking to you. It was just one time I had that opportunity with the relative that died on February 27th. Her children are she's a cousin, and her children are my cousins, but they're more like nieces and nephews. And her daughter was about 4. Her mother was diagnosed with cancer when she was 2, so they didn't tell her. But she was clearly acting out anxiety in ways that I thought meant she picked up on emotional things happening, even if she didn't know why. Like she was stealing valuable things from her parents, and so her mom was worried she was raising a thief. And I just thought, no, she's sensing something isn't right, and she's holding on to you by holding on to these valuable things. And so one day I got a chance to take her on a nature walk. So we just, the 2 of us went out, and she's 4, so she's looking at bugs on the ground and rocks. And I say, what about that bug is interesting? And she started to talk about feeling scared about something. I don't even remember what it was. And I said, I said, yeah, sometimes we do get scared. And so she talked a little, she didn't talk about her family at all, but I just sort of let her talk about being scared and what other things scare you. And we sort of started listing things that might be scary. And then what could we do if we're scared? What is our safety or security? What can we do if we feel scared? And I don't, I go talk to your mom, or go talk to your older brother, or get a dish of ice cream so you'll feel better. And we sort of clock through some of those things for what a 4-year-old could say. And I don't know if that helped her manage her fear any better, but I do think it helped her to just have somebody believe her when she said she was afraid. And I think that's the hardest thing that to do sometimes, when you want the person to feel better, to not take in that they don't feel better, that we can't, and we really can't fix that they don't feel better, but we can listen to why they don't feel good, and just taking that in. If they're angry, just letting them be and say, yes, I can feel that you're angry. That validation of how they're feeling and the validation of their experience can go a long way to helping them feel that it's more real, that it's something that they can see, and it's something they can think about and process. And it's really that processing that helps people recover their resilience.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. Another question. Can you speak to post-traumatic growth and how we can foster it after moral injury?
There are lots of things that we worked with our veterans on how to do that. One was to have a daily spiritual practice, that's yoga or Tai Chi or mindfulness meditation, to just always have a spiritual practice that keeps them in touch with their bodies and how to stay present in their bodies, because when we get stressed and anxious, we tighten up our breathing and we sort of override our body. And so to go back into the breath and go back into the body and the muscles in the body and posture and perception is really important for knowing when you're stressed and being able to calm yourself when you're stressed. So that's something that's part of, I think, post-traumatic growth is learning those skill sets. Another is to be able to use art or writing or some physical means of expressing what's going on inside of you if you're feeling troubled, because that's how you can process it. If you try to shove it down, drink or do something so you don't feel the thing, it will just keep haunting you. So people need to learn that it's okay to write something and cry. It's okay to make something and then realize that you just you didn't realize you felt that bad, but here you depicted it in a mask or in a painting or something. So the use of the arts is important. And then the other thing is to find participation in group activities that give you joy. And that can be lots of sports for a lot of people is where they enjoy doing something. I love to sing in choirs. I'm a very mediocre, somewhat not tone deaf, but not real great on pitch alto, but I love singing in choirs because it just so lifts my spirit. It's really important that people feel that place of pleasure and joy. And then the other thing I think that's really, really important to maintaining post-traumatic growth is to learn to find places of beauty and stop and just appreciate the beauty of what's around you partly as a gratitude practice. So those are some of the ways I think that we maintain our moral resilience and equilibrium and relationships.
Thank you. That all was great suggestions. Okay, it looks like the last question is how can we provide supports to staff and behavioral health care employees who may be experiencing moral injury?
Yeah, that I think it varies. I think if someone is clearly in an acute crisis, that they may need to be referred to therapy. But if it's just the kind of things you'd expect people to be feeling based on normal moral reactions to what's going on, there are processes you can engage that help them share with each other and unload some of that moral distress so that they are able to stay resilient. If they're really in a moral injury identity crisis, I think a longer term process is needed. At Volunteers America, we had veterans with pretty serious cases of moral injury, and we used a peer facilitated process that was not therapy because they're a population that resents the idea that they're broken and need therapy after they serve their country. And so we call it education and training. We use some therapeutic practices, but we teach peer facilitators how to do those things. And we have them backed up by a clinician. So if they can't handle it, there's somebody on the premises that can help. But they basically co-facilitate about 50 hours of processing that take people through a narrative arc from the start of from their origins in childhood through their moral injury experiences to the present where they can begin to process their moral injuries. It takes about 50 hours of processing to get them to that point. And we're actually working on redesigning that program for healthcare workers and others who are in professions that experience similar kinds of moral injury. But we also developed during the pandemic, because we knew moral distress was going to happen. Last summer, we began to work on a 1-hour peer facilitated sharing process that we call Resilient Strength Time, which is the acronym is REST, that stands for Resilient Strength Time. And that program, we offer 3 sessions a week for anybody who's struggling during the pandemic. It's open to the public and it doesn't cost anything. You just go to voa.org/rest. And that takes you to a place to register for an account and you can sign up on the schedule. So we've had nursing students and college students and medical people and chaplains and pastors' wives. We just had all kinds of people come into that program who find it helpful. And you can use it once or you can use it every week. We have regulars who find it useful for sustaining what they're having to do during the pandemic. So it isn't a program that addresses the severity of moral injury, but it does, I think, help people sustain what they're having to do during the pandemic. It helps them hold on. And so we're working on the other end of that, which is a longer program that will get at the moral injury questions, because I think they are already and are going to continue to be profound.
Okay, we just have a last minute question. Would you suggest the introduction of rituals like rites of passage to breathe life into brokenness?
Yes. Yes, we do those kinds of rituals in our program with veterans. We do a labyrinth walk that is actually formed to be a sort of moment of transition from one state of being into another. And we do it early in the week, so the group starts as individuals and then they meet in the center of the labyrinth as a group. And we ask them as they're walking to look around to see. And what they realize is that they're walking their own journey on a path, but they're not alone. There are other people on paths around them who will support them and be with them. And that process really helps them then become vulnerable and really share deeply the things that they need to share. We also create a group altar of objects, like they make masks of their military face. They bring a childhood object or picture and things get added all week long that they're creating. And we that's like a group altar that they gather around for their sessions. I think when you ritualize activities, they implant more deeply than if you don't ritualize them. There's something about the rhythm and the repetition of rituals that actually deliver meaning. So I think, and I think lamentation rituals, we have a ritual in our veteran program that we did where the last night, we do them at a retreat center 5 days straight intensively. But on the last night that they're together, we had some that were once a week, but the last night that they're together before the day that they do their final goodbyes and transition out, we created a ritual at the request of the first group we ran, so that they could make lists of all the things they now feel finished with and want to let go of. And they wrote them down on a piece of paper, and we have a real fire, and they read their list to say goodbye to those things, and then they put the paper in the fire and let it all go into wherever it needs to go. And that ritual has become quite powerful for people. They often will sob because they're so grateful to be able to let go of things. We've had people forgive their rapists. We've had, I remember one woman who, I have permission to say this about her, but she read a list that started, I've had so much trauma in my life. I was sexually abused by multiple members of my family. I had a mother who didn't love me. I I was neglected by the rest of my family. And she just clocked through all, and then she said in the military was a place where I was going to have stability. And then I was raped in the military. And then she went to prison on a drug charge. And she was addicted to drugs for quite a long time, lost custody of her 6-year-old son. She clocked through all of this trauma. And she said, so I've had so much trauma in my life that I didn't feel like myself if I wasn't in pain, and pain was my comfort. And I learned this week that I don't have to carry that pain. I do not have to be in pain. So I'm burning my pain. And she put that in the fire. And 2 years later, I met the adult son she'd lost custody of that was back in her life, along with her 12-year-old other son that she was raising when she came to our program. And the older son pulled me aside and said, I know this program is for the veterans, but you need to understand it's also for their families, because my mom was so different when she came home from your program. He said, I think it saved our family because she stopped being mean to us. And she actually would listen to us and talk to us. And we're like happy now. It's like he said it's like a miracle in our family. So that ritual, I think, for her was really important and powerful for her as a thing that let her let go of all that she had been carrying, that she had been inflicting on her children. So rituals are really powerful, and I think they're very important.
So we have a question based on that answer. I am working on a 6th grade rite of passage. Where would you suggest I start?
That's a great question. I think it would depend on what their traditions were. I mean, some traditions, Catholicism, a lot of Native American traditions, Judaism, have very clear adolescent rituals of passage. So I think you need to know the population you're working with and what they already bring to the table on that. And if it's an eclectic group, like it's some 6th grade public school class or something, you might actually have them contribute and talk about the traditions that they come from, or what does their family do, or what, and ask them to invent one for their group as a collective, rather than imposing something on them that might not work for them. Because I think there's some traditions that don't have adolescent passages, and there are some that do, and they, a combination of the ones that do might be kind of a cool thing for a group to invent together. So I think part of the joy of a ritual is that everybody feels included and they feel like it's theirs. And so I think if it's all one tradition, I think there's probably something in that tradition you could borrow or adapt and use. I know that's not a very specific answer, but I think trusting the people you're working with to help you figure it out is a good way to approach creating a ritual that doesn't exist yet.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. I think that answers all of our questions that we had from our participants today. We certainly appreciate the delivery of your information. And just to let everybody know, if you can click on that link in the chat box to complete the survey. Again, like Kadi said, that is tied to our funding so that we're able to provide these webinars free. And so we certainly appreciate Dr. Brock taking her time and being with us here today, and all of you taking your time to be with us here today. And we wish you all a lovely day. Thank you.
And I just have one more advertisement, which is I'm happy to share the PowerPoint. There are a few references in the PowerPoint, but if you go to voa.org/moral injury, you will find a resources section that my program assistant has organized so that you can find books, videos, scholarly essays, articles, collections, anthologies. There's a massive amount now out there available on moral injury, and it's organized by veterans, clinicians, ministers, general public. So you don't have to read everything to figure out what you might be looking for. But the references in my PowerPoint are all at the website, and mostly in the clinical or research section. And so I think it's right now on the internet, the state-of-the-art resources section on moral injury, because I have such a great program assistant and she put it together.
And Dr. Brock, everyone in the chat is saying thank you so much for the informative, great presentation. So thank you again, and everyone have a great day, and be sure to look up the information that Dr. Brock said at voa.org. Bye-bye.